The wind roared like a wild beast, drowning out every sound as Jack sprinted toward the edge of the cliff. His heart pounded in his chest, every beat a desperate plea to reach her in time. The piercing scream that had shattered the silence moments ago still echoed in his ears. There she was, teetering on the edge, her terrified eyes wide as she lost her footing and tumbled toward the abyss. Without thinking, without hesitating, Jack dove forward, his hand shooting out just in time to grab her wrist. The force of her fall nearly dragged him over the edge, the sharp gravel beneath his boots slipping precariously. "Hold on," he shouted, his voice barely audible over the chaos. She looked up at him, her face streaked with tears, her lips trembling as she cried, "Don't let go." Jack gritted his teeth, his muscles straining as he anchored himself, pulling her inch by inch away from the jagged rocks below. Finally, with a guttural roar, he hoisted her onto solid ground. They collapsed together, gasping for air. She clung to his arm, her fingers digging into his sleeve as if letting go would send her plummeting all over again. Jack's chest burned with exertion, but his mind raced faster than his heart. For the first time, he truly looked at her. Her designer jacket was torn, dirt smeared across her face, and her trembling hands still clutched a diamond-studded purse. Everything about her screamed wealth and privilege. Everything that didn't belong in a desolate, rugged place like this. Jack wiped the sweat from his brow, his voice sharp with confusion and frustration. "What were you thinking? This place isn't safe." Her lips parted, but no words came. Instead, tears welled up in her eyes, and she buried her face in her hands, sobbing uncontrollably. Jack shifted uncomfortably, unprepared for such raw emotion. His life had been a struggle for as long as he could remember. Saving someone, especially someone like her, wasn't something he'd ever imagined. But then, something about her vulnerability stirred something in him. She wasn't just scared. She was haunted. And when she finally whispered, "My name is Claire," her voice barely audible over the breeze, Jack couldn't shake the question rising in his mind. Why was she here? And more importantly, what, or who, was she running from? Jack crouched beside Claire, his breath still heavy from the rescue. She was trembling, her face pale, and her hands clutched that diamond-studded purse like it was her lifeline. He pulled a water bottle from his worn backpack and handed it to her. "Here, drink this," he said, his voice gruff but softer now. She hesitated, her hands unsteady as she took a sip. "You need to tell me what's going on," Jack pressed, watching her closely. "Why were you even out here? This isn't exactly a place for, well, someone like you." Claire didn't answer right away. Her eyes darted nervously toward the dense forest, her body stiffening at every sound. She looked like a cornered animal, ready to bolt at the slightest movement. Jack noticed it too. The rustling in the trees, faint but growing closer. His instincts kicked in. Something wasn't right. "Is someone after you?" he asked, his voice low and steady. Claire froze, her lips trembling as if she wanted to speak but couldn't. Finally, she whispered, I can't go back. They'll find me." Jack's stomach tightened. "Who's they? What did you do?" Her haunted eyes met his, tears threatening to spill. "I saw something," she murmured. "Something I wasn't supposed to. And now they're trying to make sure I can't talk." Jack's instincts screamed at him to walk away. This wasn't his problem. He was already struggling just to get by. He didn't need to add a terrified stranger and whatever mess she was in to his plate. But the desperation in her voice, the sheer terror in her eyes, made it impossible for him to turn away. Before he could ask more, the distant rustling grew louder. Claire's grip on his arm tightened like a vice. "They're here," she whispered, panic flashing across her face. "Run," Jack said, grabbing her hand and pulling her to her feet. They bolted into the forest, the sound of voices echoing behind them, growing closer with every step. Jack's lungs burned, his legs screaming for rest, but he pushed forward, adrenaline driving him. "Keep moving," he shouted, glancing back at Claire, who was struggling to keep up. They stumbled upon a narrow deer trail, weaving through the dense trees. Jack pulled Claire along, her breaths coming in shallow, frightened gasps. The voices behind them were louder now, the pursuers closing in. After what felt like an eternity, they spotted an old, abandoned cabin nestled in the woods. Without hesitation, Jack yanked the door open and shoved Claire inside, slamming it shut behind them. "Help me barricade this," he said, moving furniture in front of the windows and door. Claire's hand shook as she helped, her fear palpable. Jack leaned against the wall, catching his breath, and looked at her. "You need to tell me everything," he said firmly. "No more secrets. What exactly did you see, Claire?" Her eyes filled with tears, but her voice was steady. "A deal," she admitted. "Money, weapons, things that could ruin lives. I wasn't supposed to be there, but I saw everything. And now, they want me dead." Jack let out a frustrated breath, running a hand through his hair. He didn't know what he'd just gotten himself into, but one thing was clear. Claire wasn't safe. And now, neither was he. The forest seemed endless as Jack and Claire stumbled through the dense undergrowth, their breaths ragged and their nerves frayed. When Jack spotted the rundown cabin nestled in a small clearing, it felt like a brief reprieve in a nightmare that wouldn't end. "In here," he said, pushing open the creaking wooden door. The cabin smelled of damp wood and neglect, but it offered 4 walls and a roof, enough to buy them time. Jack immediately began searching for anything that could be used to defend themselves. A rusted fire poker leaned against the fireplace, and broken furniture littered the floor. "We need to make this place a fortress," he said, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. Claire nodded, her hands still trembling as she helped him push a heavy table against the door. "Why are they after you?" Jack asked, not looking up as he worked. "I need to know the truth if we're going to survive this." Claire hesitated, her gaze dropping to the floor. "I didn't mean to get involved," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "It was supposed to be a routine delivery, just a package I was paid to move. But I got curious. I looked inside." She paused, her breath hitching. It wasn't just money or weapons, it was documents, photos, recordings, evidence that could ruin powerful people, people with connections everywhere. Jack froze, the weight of her words sinking in. This wasn't just about greed or revenge. They were up against a criminal network with resources far beyond anything he'd ever faced. "And now they want you dead because you know too much," he said grimly. Claire nodded, tears welling in her eyes. "I didn't think they'd find out, but they saw me. They've been hunting me ever since." Jack let out a heavy sigh, gripping the fire poker tightly. "Great. So now I'm in the crosshairs of a criminal empire. Fantastic." Before Claire could respond, a faint rustling outside made both of them freeze. Jack motioned for her to stay quiet, moving to peek through a crack in the boarded-up window. In the fading light, he spotted shadowy figures moving toward the cabin. "They're here," he whispered, his voice tense. The first attacker hit one of the makeshift tripwires Jack had set, triggering a cascade of broken furniture and debris that sent him sprawling. But the others pressed forward, their shouts growing louder. The door shook violently as the intruders rammed against it, the table barricading it creaking under the pressure. "Stay behind me," Jack ordered, gripping the fire poker like a lifeline. The door burst open and chaos erupted. The first man charged in, and Jack swung the poker with all his strength, catching him in the ribs. He staggered back, but another attacker lunged, pinning Jack against the wall. Claire screamed, fumbling in her purse. Suddenly, a deafening gunshot rang out. The man grappling Jack went rigid, his eyes wide with shock, before collapsing to the floor. Jack turned to see Claire, the gun in her trembling hand still smoking. "Where the hell did you get that?" Jack shouted, his voice sharp. "I told you," Claire said, her voice shaky but firm. "I came prepared." The remaining attacker bolted, realizing the fight wasn't worth the risk. For a moment, the cabin fell silent except for the sound of their labored breaths. Jack looked at Claire, her hands trembling as she clutched the gun. He placed a calming hand on her shoulder. "We're not out of this yet," he said, his voice steady despite the fear gripping him. "They'll send more. We need to move." Claire nodded, the terror in her eyes replaced by a flicker of determination. Together, they stepped out into the dark forest, leaving the wrecked cabin behind. The battle was over, but the war was just beginning. The air was heavy with tension as Jack and Claire trudged through the forest, their steps silent but their minds racing. Jack had been patient, but now, after the chaos in the cabin, his patience was wearing thin. He stopped abruptly, turning to face her. "No more half-truths, Claire," he said, his voice sharp but controlled. "I need to know everything. Who are these people, and why are they so desperate to find you?" Claire hesitated, her eyes darting around as if searching for an escape. But there was nowhere to run. With a deep breath, she met his gaze. "The deal I stumbled on wasn't just about money or weapons," she began, her voice trembling. "It was about control, blackmail material on powerful people. Politicians, CEOs, even law enforcement. These criminals don't just break laws, they own the people who enforce them." Jack's stomach turned as her words sank in. "So, we're not just dealing with some small-time thugs. These guys have connections that go all the way to the top," he said grimly. Claire nodded, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to get involved. I was just delivering a package. But when I saw what was inside, photos, recordings, documents that could destroy lives, I couldn't just look away." Her voice broke and tears welled in her eyes. "And now they'll do anything to silence me." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair. "You're telling me we're up against a criminal empire with unlimited resources, and they'll stop at nothing to find you?" He shook his head, frustration boiling beneath his calm exterior. "Great. Just great." Claire's shoulders sagged, the weight of her confession leaving her visibly drained. "I know I've put you in danger," she said softly. "And I'm sorry. I didn't mean for any of this to happen." Jack studied her for a moment, then let out a heavy sigh. "Sorry doesn't mean much when we're running for our lives," he said. "But we're in this now, so we need a plan." Claire hesitated before speaking. "There's a safe house nearby," she said. "I used it once when I was on a delivery. It's hidden, and it might still have supplies." Jack raised an eyebrow, skeptical but out of options. "Fine," he said. "Lead the way." When they reached the safe house, it was exactly as Claire had described, a rundown shack tucked deep in the woods. The air inside was stale, and cobwebs hung from the corners, but it was secluded. It would do. Claire pulled up a loose floorboard, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside were a flashlight, a first aid kit, and a small stash of cash. "It's not much, but it's a start," she said, handing Jack the flashlight. Jack nodded, already scanning the room for ways to fortify their position. "We'll set traps," he said. "If they find us, we'll make sure they regret it." They worked together, rigging tripwires and barricading the doors. Jack sharpened stakes from broken furniture, while Claire used fishing line to create crude alarms. Despite the urgency, Jack couldn't help but notice how capable she was. "You're pretty handy with this stuff," he remarked, tying a knot. "I had to learn," Claire replied, not meeting his eyes. "When you're running for your life, you figure things out." Her words hit harder than Jack expected. He didn't know much about her past, but it was clear she'd been through more than her share of hardship. As night fell, they sat together in the dim light of the flashlight. The silence between them was heavy, but not uncomfortable. Finally, Jack broke it. "You can't keep running forever," he said, his voice firm. "If we're going to survive this, we need to fight back." Claire looked at him, her expression conflicted. "I've been running for so long," she admitted. "I don't even know how to stop." "You stop by standing your ground," Jack said simply. "You have the evidence to take them down. You just need to believe you can." Her eyes met his, a flicker of hope breaking through the fear. "You really think we can do this?" Jack nodded. "I wouldn't be here if I didn't." In that moment, something shifted between them. Claire's fear gave way to resolve, and Jack realized he wasn't just protecting her anymore. He was fighting alongside her. Together, they began to form a plan, their bond growing stronger with every decision. Running was no longer an option. It was time to fight back. The city lights flickered in the distance as Jack and Claire cautiously approached their destination. The tension between them was palpable, each step heavier than the last. Claire's contact, a supposed ally, was their only lead, their last chance to find a way out of the nightmare they'd been trapped in. "Are you sure about this?" Jack asked, his voice low but firm. Claire nodded, though her hands trembled slightly. "He owes me. He's the one person I know who might actually help." Jack wasn't convinced, but he didn't argue. They had no other options. The warehouse was dimly lit and eerily quiet as they entered, every shadow a potential threat. The contact, a man in his mid-40s with a nervous demeanor, greeted them with a forced smile. "Claire," he said, his tone overly casual. "I didn't think I'd see you again." "We don't have time for small talk," Claire replied sharply. "I need your help. They're after me, and I have evidence that could bring them down." The man hesitated, glancing around as if to make sure they were alone. Jack's instincts flared. Something was off. "You can trust me," the man finally said, his voice almost too smooth. "Let me see the evidence, and I'll make sure it gets into the right hands." Claire hesitated, her grip tightening on her purse. But before she could respond, the sound of footsteps echoed through the warehouse. Jack turned sharply, his eyes scanning the shadows. "It's a trap," he growled. The ambush was swift. Men emerged from the darkness, armed and ready. The contact stepped back, his hands raised in mock surrender. "I'm sorry, Claire," he said, almost regretfully. "They made me an offer I couldn't refuse." "You son of a—" Jack started, but there was no time for anger. The attackers closed in, and chaos erupted. Jack grabbed a steel pipe from the ground, using it to block an incoming blow. He swung with everything he had, knocking one man to the ground. Meanwhile, Claire ducked behind a crate, frantically pulling the handgun from her purse. She fired a shot, the sound deafening in the enclosed space. One of the attackers fell, but more kept coming. "Move!" Jack shouted, grabbing Claire's arm as they bolted for the exit. Bullets whizzed past them, and Jack felt the sharp sting of a graze on his arm. They stumbled into the alley, their breaths ragged, but the danger wasn't over. "We can't keep running," Claire cried, her voice shaking. Jack glanced at her, his eyes blazing with determination. "We're not running anymore." They found brief refuge in an abandoned building nearby, barricading the doors to buy time. Claire dug through her purse, pulling out a small USB drive. "This is it," she said, holding it up. "This is everything. Proof of their deals, their connections, everything we need to expose them." Jack took the drive, his jaw tight. "Then we use it. We take this straight to the public." Claire hesitated, fear flickering in her eyes. "If we do this, they'll come after us harder than ever." "They're already coming after us," Jack replied. "The only way to stop them is to take away their power." Together, they devised a plan. Jack hacked into a public server at a nearby internet cafe, uploading the evidence to multiple news outlets and social media platforms. Within minutes, the files went live, sparking a firestorm of public outrage. As they watched the chaos unfold from a safe distance, Claire's shoulders sagged with relief. "It's done," she said softly, tears streaming down her face. Jack placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "It's not over yet," he said, "but at least now they can't hide anymore." The fallout was immediate. Headlines exploded with news of the conspiracy, and law enforcement had no choice but to act. The powerful network that had hunted Claire was dismantled piece by piece, their untouchable image shattered. As the sun rose over the city, Jack and Claire stood side by side, battered but alive. For the first time in days, there was a glimmer of hope. "You saved my life," Claire said, her voice trembling. Jack shook his head. "We saved each other." And for the first time, they allowed themselves to believe that maybe, just maybe, they had a chance at a new beginning. The fallout was swift and merciless. Within hours of the evidence going public, the once untouchable criminal network began to crumble. News outlets plastered their faces across every screen, and the shocking extent of their corruption was laid bare for the world to see. High-profile arrests followed, one after another, as Claire's tormentors were dragged out of their mansions and offices in handcuffs. The same powerful figures who had hunted her were now exposed, their influence shattered under the weight of undeniable truth. Jack and Claire watched the coverage from the safety of a small, quiet cafe, their faces illuminated by the soft glow of the television. They were exhausted, battered, and scarred, but they were alive and free. Claire let out a shaky breath, her hands trembling as she reached for her coffee. "It's finally over," she whispered, tears welling in her eyes. Jack nodded, staring out the window at the bustling city streets. "Yeah, it is," he said, his voice low. But as the reality of their journey sank in, he realized it wasn't just Claire's life that had changed. Saving her had awakened something in him. A strength. A purpose he hadn't known he had. He'd spent so long struggling just to survive. But now, he felt like he'd found something worth fighting for. Claire turned to him, her gaze soft but full of gratitude. "I don't know how to thank you," she said. "You risked everything for me. You didn't have to, but you did." Jack shrugged, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his lips. "You didn't give me much of a choice," he teased, but his tone carried a warmth that hadn't been there before. "Besides, I think we both needed this more than we realized." She laughed softly, wiping a tear from her cheek. "So, what now?" she asked, a hint of hope in her voice. Jack leaned back in his chair, considering the question. "I guess we figure it out," he said. "One step at a time. But whatever happens, you're not facing it alone." Claire smiled, a genuine smile that lit up her face despite everything they'd been through. For the first time, she felt like the fear that had haunted her for so long was finally starting to fade. Together, they stepped out into the sunlight, ready to face whatever came next. Did this thrilling story inspire you? Let us know your favorite moment in the comments, and don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more gripping tales of courage, love, and redemption.